Tonight's agenda, we're going to talk about how we reform the federal government. And we've got one of the best and brightest minds from Cato Institute, who's a senior policy fellow, who's going to talk about how we can reform the federal government and how we can put our country's spending back on track so we can put American families back to work. Please join me in welcoming senior policy fellow Dan Mitchell.
Thank you very much. In my life, I've been the warm-up speaker for a prime minister, a Nobel Prize winner, and now a presidential candidate. But a presidential candidate who did a very good job in the Cato Institute's report card on the governors. So I do appreciate AFP for giving me the opportunity to get outside the Beltway to at least have a brief visit to the real world before I go back to Washington. So I'm thankful for that reason. But I'm a little bit irked because they said you have 5 minutes to explain the entire budget mess in Washington. I said, wait, not 5 months, not 5 weeks, not 5 days, 5 minutes? And I thought, well, how am I going to do that? But then I went to the Congressional Budget Office website, and I dug into the numbers, and let me see if I still have them. I still do. And I looked at the latest forecast, and anybody can do this, cbo.gov. $3.2 trillion of revenue are going to Washington this year, according to the estimate, and they're going to spend $3.7 trillion. Now, I'm not a math genius, but that's $500 billion deficit, which, by the way, is progress compared to where we were a few years ago. But nonetheless, let's think about it. How do we solve this mess? How do we control the overspending? How do we balance the budget? Well, let's do a show of hands. Who would want to cut spending? Raise your hand. Okay, a lot of hands up. Who would want spending to grow by the rate of inflation, 2%? Raise your hands. And who wants spending to grow faster than the rate of inflation? I don't even see a single hand up for that. Well, here's the thing that you'll never find out if you read the establishment media in Washington or you listen to a lot of the politicians. If you look at that Congressional Budget Office 10-year forecast, where you'll find for 2015 that $3.2 trillion of revenue and that $3.7 trillion of spending, you look at that 10-year forecast and the Congressional Budget Office projects that even without 1 penny of tax increases over the next 10 years, tax revenue by the time we get to the year 2025 will be a little bit more than $5 trillion. Now you do the math on that, and you basically will discover that tax revenue is going to grow by an average of 4.67% a year. Even took it to 2 decimal points. Now let's do a little mental exercise here. If revenues are growing 4.67% a year, what do we need to do to make progress on the budget? We obviously simply need to have spending grow by less than that every year. It's not rocket science. I mean, the special interests in Washington will get upset at the thought of government being on a diet and spending not being able to grow as fast as they want. But do you realize if you just take those numbers, that $3.2 trillion of revenue for this fiscal year, and you project it out over the next 10 years and you match it up to the spending, what do you have to do to balance the budget? If you simply have spending grow at the rate of inflation for the next 10 years, well, not even for the next 10 years, simply over the next 5 years, you can balance your budget by the year 2020. It's that simple. If you want spending to grow faster than the rate of inflation, which I, of course, don't want that to happen, but you could still balance the budget by 2024 in 9 years, simply by having government grow 3% a year. Now, this sounds so simple. The obvious question that I always get is, why isn't it happening? It isn't happening because Washington budgets off a baseline. They assume from the very beginning of the process that government should grow however fast they've done it in the past. And so if government's growing 7% a year and someone says, well, wait, why don't we have government only grow 3% a year? You know what they say? That's a 4% cut. Now, no one in the real world does their math that way. I mean, could you imagine going to the Home Depot and buying a new riding lawnmower, and you come back and you tell your spouse, hey, I saved $500 for our family budget. Well, how'd you do that? Oh, I spent $1,000, but it was on sale for $1,500. That is the way they literally budget in Washington. And that's why we have a mess. That's why we have a federal government that's out of control. And so really the only message I want to leave with you is the very simple one. We should cut spending, but we can actually balance the budget so long as we have a modest bit of spending restraint. So there's 4 takeaways that I'll close on here. First, you don't need any tax increases. I mean, that's like giving alcoholics the key to a liquor store to give Washington new revenue. They're never going to reform programs and restore our economy if they think they have the revenue option on the table. The second thing to remember is simply follow the golden rule of have spending grow slower than the private sector, because what's the private sector? The private sector is your tax base. So if the nominal GDP is growing 4 to 5% a year and spending's growing 2 to 3% a year, you're going to make progress. And then the third message is if you want to deal with and try to at least address and solve Washington corruption and cronyism, make government smaller relative to the productive sector of the economy. Slowly but surely shrink government spending as a share of GDP, and you'll sort of cut off the oxygen that feeds a lot of the special interest deal making in Washington. And number 4, there's really only one choice we have facing us. Do we go on the road to Greece, or do we go on the road to reform? And that's why I'm so grateful to Americans for Prosperity to giving me this opportunity to help put our nation on the route to reform. Thank you very much.